Okay, since we've only got an hour, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Queer and Trans Perspectives in Academia. I'm super excited about today's discussion. It's a topic that I feel is very vital, is very close to my heart, and it's Pride Month, so good time to do it. Although I think these are discussions we should be having all year round. Just to introduce myself, my name is Lina Ashwood. I'm a Corporate Communications and Public Affairs Manager at Sage Publishing, and outside of that, I'm also a writer and community organizer. Just to let you know how the session is going to go, I'm going to do a quick intro. Each speaker will present their thoughts for a few minutes. We'll have a sort of like roundtable and then open it up for a audience Q&A, which you can submit your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom. Please note that within this space, we will not be giving any sort of like space or room for homophobic or transphobic comments. This is definitely a space of inquiry and discussion, but it also needs to be inclusive and a safer space than we're normally sort of used to in academia around these particular topics. So to get started, I feel it's generally quite important to have an intersectional and interdisciplinary approach to both queer and trans studies. And you will see from the bios of these amazing speakers that they come from a wide array of disciplines. But underlying all of these things is a sort of understanding of queerness and transness just beyond the identity approach to it. So beyond the sexual orientation and beyond the gender identity. And what does that mean for academic research or within this particular space? And so to start us off, I wanted to share a couple of definitions that I personally found quite useful in thinking through this. Martin Manlinson talks about queer both as an anti-normative signifier, as well as a social category produced through the intersectionality of identities, practices, and institutions, which brings us to a very interesting point of once we start using queer as a verb and not just as an individual identity, what does it mean then to queer our understanding of social problems? What does it mean to queer knowledge or to queer an institution? And how can that be brought in to enrich some of the more traditional social sciences? And a definition of transing that I also found particularly useful from Alyosha Tudor says that it means to go beyond a certain category, to question a category, and to deconstruct a category. And I think both of these definitions are really useful in the sense that they didn't originate within the academy and become very useful to sort of interrogating academic research as such and talk back to it in ways that are different and imaginative. And so to give you an introduction to these amazing speakers, Andrew De La Tolla is a lecturer in Middle Eastern Studies in the School of Languages, Cultures and Societies at the University of Leeds and a visiting research fellow at the Middle East Centre at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His research focuses on issues of race, gender and sexuality in relation to statehood and state formation. His recent publications include Civilization and the Making of the State in Lebanon and Syria and Sexuality as a Standard of Civilization. Marquise Bey is Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Northwestern. Their work focuses on Blackness and fugitivity, transness, and Black feminist theory. Bey is particularly concerned with modes of subjectivity that index otherwise ways of being, utilizing Blackness and transness as fugitive extra-ontological postures, as names for such otherwise subjectivities. These two analytics, rather than endowments of the epidermis or specific bodily morphologies, are the axes around which Bey thinks about subjectivity formation and deformation, abolition, and political work. They are the author of the forthcoming Black Trans Feminism. Megan Todd is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Central Lancashire. She has conducted a range of sexualities research projects, including an analysis of LGBT plus domestic abuse service users in Lancashire and online hate directed at sexualized and marginalized bodies. Her research focuses on sexualities, gender, and violence. She has also recently published on issues relating to intimate partner violence and homophobic and misogynist abuse online. She is currently developing work on universities' management of their LGBT plus heritage, and she is the author of Sexualities and Society. I will be sharing links to all of the books I mentioned right now in their bios, and we'll also be sharing a link to a sort of microsite that Sage has collated for free to access LGBT plus research. Okay, so to start us off, Megan, can you hear me? I think Megan may be experiencing some technical issues. Hello? All right, how about we give it a few minutes and start with Andrew instead, if you're okay with that? That'd be great, thank you, go ahead.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me, Lena. It's an honor and a pleasure to have been invited and to be speaking with this group of panelists. I'm going to be talking particularly about queer methodologies and queer methods. And I'm beginning this kind of thought process in relation to a current project that I'm working on. It's part of a wider project. And so I am going to be talking about kind of the social scientific epistemologies that have shaped social scientific inquiry and social scientific methods and methodologies. So queer methods and methodologies, similar to feminist methods and methodologies, are disruptive. And that's my starting point, right? They are developed from an understanding of the world and a lived experience that troubles the assertions made from the positionality of white cis hetero masculinity. And queer methods and methodologies, like feminist methods and methodologies, are derived from particular epistemologies, particular experiences, and particular identities that have historically not had the hegemonic position to assert or challenge the socially constructed social scientific study of the world. So over the next 8 minutes or so, I will be outlining how our understanding of the social world is based on an epistemology of white, Western, cis heteromasculinity, the logics of this epistemology, and what kinds of challenges and disruptions queer methods and methodologies pose to social scientific inquiry, and what the possibilities of engaging in a queer methodological or queer will to knowledge can do for our study as we move forward in the social sciences. So as some of you may have guessed, we can see 3 areas of epistemological positionality that has influenced traditional social scientific methodology. And this isn't just about kind of looking at white, Western, cis heteromasculinity, but it's about looking at the dynamics of race, sexuality, and gender, and how each one of these has influenced our ways of thinking, our political world, our social world, and how that has been embedded in our engagement in methods and methodologies. So with regards to race, we see the development of hierarchies primarily, beginning after the Enlightenment and becoming embedded with the scientific revolution and industrialization. Race has played an important role in discerning families of flora and fauna, leading to botanical and zoological organization of the world, but it did not end there, right? When we think about race, we typically think about the human race. We think about the races of humankind and the kinds of violences that have been produced from racial scientific thinking. And these ways of thinking, these conceptions of race, have been tied to human phenotypes, to biological and social development. And here, historically, there's been an assertion that there exists 3, and in the 20th century later, 4 races of mankind: the Caucasian, the Asian, and the Black, and later to include the Indigenous American. And what this did was it established a hierarchy where the Caucasian was considered the most developed, the leader of the world in terms of social, political, economic, and technological progress, where the Asian was considered partially civilized or barbarous, and the Black, African, and Indigenous Australasian was considered the least developed or the savage. And this obviously influenced a lot of practices of empire and colonialism, as well as slavery. And this hierarchy of the human race that tied biology to social development made its way into the very foundations of social science disciplines, including international relations, or what was then known in the 19th century as colonial management and governance, as well as political science, sociology, anthropology, and economics. So while the language of race has since become outdated, for the most part, particularly after the Second World War, it was very much so replaced with the language of culture. And we see this in its most evident forms when we question a society's supposed inability to engage in what are otherwise considered normal forms of governance, often invoking questions such as, is Islam compatible with democracy? So what a queer methodology does here is it disrupts those hierarchies. And I'm not talking about flattening out the hierarchies, but rather to show how those hierarchies are in and themselves not stable, right? To show how those hierarchies are not only problematic in the way we think about the world and the kinds of hierarchies that we develop. They may not be racially explicit, but they are still there. And so we need to start to think about ways in which we can subvert those hierarchies when we're thinking about our engagement in a will to knowledge. But going back to this idea of normal forms of governance, here this notion of normal highlights the sexual epistemological foundations of our will to knowledge and the foundations of supposed universal methods and methodologies. Where the normal is associated with the heterosexed engagements of the world, the contrasting position is that of a perversion or the homosext. And this categorization of the good and bad, the normal and the perverse, relates not just to ideas of sexual morality, but the logics attached to heterosexuality and homosexuality, where heterosex formations and relations lend itself to reproduction, biological reproduction, but also social reproduction, and are seen as the necessary tools or necessary engagements and relations for social political continuity, as well as capitalist accumulation, expansion, and development. In contrast, the homosex relations threaten the reproductive qualities of household rule and its modern capitalist variants. In other words, it threatens the continuity of social reproduction. And this helps to inflect meaning into objects of study that are characterized as good versus bad, what are seen as good revolts or revolutions, for example, such as the French Revolution, versus bad revolutions or revolts, including anti-colonial or anti-capitalist revolts or revolutions, or even those that kicked off at Stonewall, where the qualities of social reproduction in these bad revolutions, in these perversions, are challenging social reproduction and engaged in kinds of forms of thinking and engagement with the world that are not normative, are anti-normative, are queer. However, with the LGBTQ movements, where the state has provided pathways to normalization, the radical grain of queer politics was co-opted through homonationalism and homonormativity. And what this does is it sends up a flag. And it sends up a flag to us when we're thinking about queer methods and methodologies, because it should open us to think about how queer methods needs to resist co-optation by institutions and structures that seek to build constraints, seek to build walls, and seek to build frameworks that create a sense of queer being one single thing. It exists in the multiple. The final epistemic positionality is that of gender, where the socio-capitalist constraints related to gender are most evident in household rule, which privilege the man at the head of the household, able to move through public and private space, is considered the leader, the breadwinner, and the teacher of the other members of the household. Here, feminist interventions have dealt with this division of labor and have taken aim at this process of codification tied to this division of labor and hierarchical relations within the household, where characteristics historically tied to masculinity have been privileged and where characteristics of masculinity have been privileged and those associated with femininity have been denigrated. We see this in the scholarship of gendered states, where underdeveloped states, or so-called underdeveloped states, are seen as irrational, in need of social elevation, emotional, disordered, or frantic in their decision-making, where practices of development are keen to imbue these states with masculine characteristics to make them developed, rational, and strong. So digging deeper into this, the methods and methodologies that we are taught, that we use, and are socialized into from a very young age reference these epistemological intellectual framings of the world of particular hegemonic white cis-hetero masculinity. And they emerge from a particular positionality of intellectual curiosity beginning in the late 17th century and carried forward until today, placing other knowledge systems into hierarchies, viewing them as perverse and seeing them as culturally embedded. Whereas white Western cis-hetero masculine knowledge systems, the knowledge systems developed by European explorers, modern imperialists, and colonizers, are coined as universal. So what a queer methodology does then, as an epistemological method and methodology in itself, is asks about the spaces in between, the interstitial spaces, the overlaps, the ability of an object of study to be normal and or perverse, strong and or weak, developed and or underdeveloped. And to quote Cynthia Weber from her book, Queer International Relations, queer subjectivities provide the possibility of those subjectivities that do not signify as either one sex, gender, and or sexuality or another. There are subjectivities that signify as also more than one sex, gender, and or sexuality, and often at the same time. And I would argue that it does not stop there. Queer methods and methodologies also look at failure, right? As Jack Halberstam talks about, not as something that needs correction, not as an opportunity to learn from, but as something that is inherent to our lived experience. And crucially, it accepts the queer experience, queer knowledge without constraints, something that is to be reinvestigated, remolded, and rethought. So by bringing a queer epistemological positionality into methods and methodology to question the kinds of methods and methodologies that are taught in the social sciences and our will to knowledge, in my opinion, we open up a space for new kinds of questions to develop rather than just trying to find a determined answer to a question. And doing this means that there are new opportunities to re-engage in new forms of questioning and knowledge making that take aim at the very hierarchies and binaries, the categories and the classifications that shape how we think about the social world. And on that, I'll leave it there and let one of my colleagues take over the conversation. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Andrew. I've already taken a couple of notes, so hopefully we'll be able to come back to those. I'm just going to do a quick check with Megan, see how our internet connection is going. Anybody?
I'm so sorry. Yeah, no, things have improved remarkably after just coming in and out, ironically.
It always works.
Yeah, so things are okay. And I'm so sorry that I missed most of Andrew's talk there because it was fascinating, the end bit that I heard.
Well, it'll be available on YouTube on our page later, so you can go back and watch it. But yes, floor is yours, please.
Okay, all right. Well, I haven't really got very much of a formal talk as such. And really, I just wanted to talk to you all a little. And firstly, thank you very much, especially for those of you in the UK who are not watching the match rather than, listening to this. So thank you very much. So yeah, I wanted to talk about a little bit of research that I've been involved in with a colleague at Manchester University. I'm based at the University of Central Lancashire. which is looking at the ways in which universities either kind of acknowledge their LGBT plus past and history, and if so, how do they do that, and what are they doing with the kind of archives and heritage? Now, this is something that universities in the United States have been doing quite well, actually, for some time. And there's only a handful of universities really in the UK that are kind of using their heritage in a way as to kind of really showcase a genuine diversity and inclusivity in the university. And of course, you know, the influence of queer people upon universities, that their social, their cultural, their intellectual, and indeed the economic sphere, it resonates across time and space. But you know, LGBT plus heritage is everywhere, yet stories about universities' cultural heritage very often tend to reflect a kind of heterosexual past, I would argue. Queer history and heritage has been somewhat blighted, perhaps by, you know, the long criminal persecution and moral condemnation of gender and sexual non-conformity. And it's also linked, of course, with the ways in which, you know, those who engage in sexualities research more generally have acknowledged, it's something that many have written about, the ways in which research into sexualities is still stigmatized. You know, it impacts on pay, promotion, attitudes in the workplace, that kind of thing. And I think universities are kind of missing a trick here. Universities, obviously, as many of us know, have a huge potential to transform lives. Environments where, you know, students perhaps, you know, hopefully are empowered to reach their full potential, where strong networks are formed, you know, and where people have the opportunity to stand up for things that are important to them. And in addition to this, for LGBT plus people, universities can be environments that truly allow them to be themselves, whatever that might be. But actually, when you look, so for example, Uclan, where I am, is not alone. When you look at surveys for both staff and students in terms of declaring sexuality, there are huge gaps. There's a huge percentage of staff and students who are choosing not to declare their sexuality. Now, first of all, we can't assume that those choosing not to declare their sexuality are LGBT plus, and there will be lots of reasons why people will choose not to declare their sexuality, and that might be something we want to talk about a little later on. But one could assume perhaps that a lack of sense of true equality, true recognition, true celebration of LGBT plus lives may well be part of that. Lots of universities are now kind of, you know, is it a tick box exercise, the equality and diversity, the celebration of LGBT plus History Month or Pride Month, but very often that's it. And I think doing something with heritage is a real way to boost, of course, and this students, universities in a neoliberal world are keen to do this. It's going to boost recruitment of staff and students. It's going to you know, boost retention, improve kind of ratings on the Stonewall Index or what other index that universities are measured against. But more than that, it will tell us something very meaningful about university life across time. And also it tells us also something about the heritage, the relationship of universities with the towns and cities that they are placed within, and kind of really fosters some kind of cross-community relationship that I think lots of universities in the UK are not kind of exploiting as well as they could do. So, you know, this is part of a piece of research, as I say, that we've started at Uclan in collaboration with colleagues at the University of Manchester, where we have started initially just to have a look at the archives, the university archives, seeing them as kind of institutional repositories, really, that enable us or give us one method of glimpsing the past, those communities and their past. And as such, they have a real potential to enable us to better understand the lives of LGBT plus staff and students from the past, as well as at present, of course, as well. But equally, what's been quite telling is those silences and absences in the archives that tell us something perhaps about the challenges that LGBT plus groups have faced in the past, and arguably the challenges they still face now. Both through the lack of resources that exist perhaps on the lives of LGBT people in universities in the past, but also the fact that we're talking about a community who frequently wish to avoid the eyes of the authorities. And of course, researching archives poses some very interesting challenges, doesn't it? That it's very difficult to fix or capture hidden lives. Often the paperwork that does exist, such as minutes from committees perhaps, or official publications, it doesn't perhaps present a very rich account of these lives. And also, of course, in many cases, past collecting strategies didn't give the lives of these groups, you know, for example, through their activism and societies, priority. But that's something that we can rectify today. Although being very mindful, of course, of the fact that one shouldn't put a present-minded lens on lives in the past, so that there are difficulties and challenges there too. For example, the use of a phrase like LGBT plus. Can we sort of use these labels to talk about same-sex relationships, perhaps, you know, of the 19th century, for instance? So we've done kind of keyword searches using historic and contemporary concepts within the archives of the University of Manchester, and perhaps not surprisingly, the archives there actually revealed several avenues of interest with regard, you know, recording LGBT plus lives, and Alan Turing being the obvious candidate there. But there are also lots of interesting stories to do with student societies from the 1970s, for example, the Homophile Society, campaigns around key moments in history, the Wolfenden Report, of course, or Section 28, the AIDS crisis. So there were real moments of kind of rich data that were revealed through our research there. It was a bit of a different story at Uclan. There wasn't really very much, and I suspect, like many universities across the UK, it's not really been a priority of archivists or universities themselves. So I think that's a project that we need to work on. But of course, talking about football earlier, we have got some notable local characters. Lily Parr, for example, the famous footballer who was part of Preston Ladies Football Club, had various links with the college as it was at the time. So LGBTQ heritage, we're arguing, really kind of refers to a whole range of histories of individuals, of communities, staff and students, but also local community groups as well, who have been marginalised, arguably, in the way in which they've been written about, recorded. But also we're interested in the way in which sometimes universities are drawing on their history, but perhaps doing so for reasons that don't fit with or map onto kind of the needs that come from those communities themselves. So it's about how are these archives, how is this heritage being used, and why is it being used in the way? Something that I think we need to think about a little bit more as well. I'm rambling because but you know, one of the kind of takeaway points I think from this is that universities are very often custodians of a really rich source of documentation regarding the lives of their staff and students, both past and present, and you know that there are records there will be that chart their engagement with local communities too. And I think these offer a really important opportunity through which we can better understand our LGBT lives of the past within universities. So, you know, ongoing research it wants to really look at the way in which universities have managed to do this successfully. Universities like Liverpool, for example, have kind of made real strides in terms of celebrating their university LGBT heritage. So what can we learn from these universities, and how can we perhaps encourage more universities to do this to the, you know, for the better of both their own community but the wider community, of course, as well. So I will leave it there and pass the mantle on.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was really fascinating. And what I love about both of these sort of positions is that we begin to understand that these sort of hierarchies of power don't just exist in a sort of theoretical, conceptual realm or, you know, knowledge, but they then play out in on an institutional level and an individual level. And, you know, it influences how we understand culture, how we understand history, ours and everybody else's. And the ramifications of it are usually quite wider than we understand. Ooh. Very noisy, sorry about that. Okay, yes, more notes that I've taken. I think one of the big takeaways for me is, again, who writes the narratives, who decides, and who gets silenced throughout all of these conversations. So, Marquise?
Thank you so much. I'm super humbled to be here. I'm super grateful to have been invited. Thank you, Lena, for the invitation. Super grateful to my colleagues on the panel here for the really brilliant thought that they've shared. So I'm here to talk today briefly about abolition and trans theory. And I'm not properly speaking, or even improperly speaking, a sociologist. I'm, in a very fundamental way, a critical theorist and a literary scholar, among other things. So I hope my presence here, despite this, is welcome. And I hope to offer a different register on which to think about these topics than some might be used to. So without to delay, I'll get right into it. I am motivated toward abolition via transness and trans study, which leads me to a desire for something like gender abolition. For me, it is a coalitional effort. Gender abolition is encouraged to occur now, and it is deeply unsatisfactory, to me at least, to wait to do that when purportedly more important things are hashed out, especially not in service of a kind of ethics that resounds like, we cannot get rid of gender right now, or else how will we address gender-based harms? To me, gender is the harm. What is sexism, discrimination, and assault along gendered lines but the committing of gender? We need not settle woman or even the parameters of gender in order to advance a politics in service of those harmed by sexism and indeed harmed by gender itself. Quote, when laws and social policies represent women, Judith Butler writes, reflecting on the legacy of their now 30-year-old book, quote, they make tacit decisions about who counts as a woman and very often make presuppositions about what a woman is. We have seen this in the domain of reproduction rights. So the question I was asking then is, do we need to have a settled idea of women or any gender in order to advance feminist goals, unquote? And the answer, I think, is no. We can and have and should be doing subjectivity and sociality in ways that engender a different terrain on which we can live that need not and perhaps should not be concerned with a particular demographic. Not because that demographic does not matter, but because it's less about the demographic and more, much more, about the mechanisms in place, the histories, variable as they are, the discourses, the systems, the institutions, structures, the networks that create demographic delimitations to be placed in hierarchical and antagonistic relationship. It is about what happened that made logical the invention of a denigrated class of people or non-people as natural. That is the cause we must not forget. It's not like, and this is the contentious claim to be sure, there were women categorically, and then it seemed natural to oppress them. The oppression created the very class of women, not the other way around. Coalition happens via non-sanctioned coming togethers. That is, in excess of legible taxonomies and categorization, themselves imposed and given ontologies that exist ahead of us, that form us before we have a form or can choose a form or unform or non-form. Coalition and radicality might more effectively arise through indiscrete, devious assemblages that do not map onto the state's grammars of demography. And gender is an impediment to our coming together. And oftentimes, if we do come together, a violent circumscription of how we are permitted to come together. Deemed a man and required to remain a man, to indeed be and do your manness, seems that you cannot simply have platonic relationships with women. You cannot let that woman best you in a physical sport or this game of wit. You cannot let her in any way control you or have you on a leash or whipped. You cannot work together with her without there being the possibility of sexual exchange. You cannot interact with her on nonviolent grounds. You cannot not do gender with her. You cannot not do gender with anyone. How can we truly come together with this in place? It is necessary to understand gender as a thing that requires constant surveillance, policing of its boundaries, what to wear and with whom to converse, reprimand if done incorrectly, or smuggling in something improper to its realm, imagistic perpetuation of itself, what to consume, where to go, whom to love, and dismally limited options. Thus, gender itself is a kind of prison. What is needed is defiance of this system, which is more accurately a system inasmuch as the prison industrial complex is enabled in part by gender normativity. Regimes of normative sexuality and gender, that is, are organizing structures of the prison industrial complex. Gender as such is a product and producer of carceral logics. The surveillance queries of are you a boy or a girl, or boys don't do that, are disciplinary behaviors indexical of carcerality. Thus, abolition entails a radical deconstruction of heteronormativity, the gender binary, and all their attending vectors. Gender must be, in my estimation, abolished. I'll share a conversation I had with a colleague, one of the most radically ethical and ethically radical scholars I know. It was conveyed to me that when speaking to one of their partners, their nesting partner, there was the assertion that it is not so much that gender itself is bad, but gender roles. Launching from the generative phrase, riffing on a few mutually loved queer theorists that gender might be a kind of prison, the two of them came to a tentative consensus that gender is not imprisoning, but that gender roles, the forcing of certain kinds of gender behaviors, is what is imprisoning. They both agreed that there was much that was limiting about gender. They conceded its restrictiveness. But my colleague was forced to pause when thinking about trans people who find liberation in gender when they are able to articulate their gender identity in contradistinction to their birth-assigned gender. At least the way it is articulated by friends, gender is a kind of prison at one time and a kind of liberation at another. And I do not want to erase that reality for many people. My colleague's partner, also a phenomenally lovely and erudite person, noted that the problem is that there is a conception of one singular thing called masculinity, for example, which is really about gender roles rather than gender itself. For their partner, no two people have the same gender, and thus gender is infinite in its expressions by individuals. So now, my colleague wrote to me, quote, I'm wondering about how to disarticulate gender from gender roles and what this means or what it might mean or have to do with thinking about abolition and queer liberation, unquote. I was invited to respond, and I did, thankful for such a carefully thought through exchange. My response begins with a question. Is it proper to say that trans folks who move away from birth-assigned genders and find liberation in, say, womanhood as trans women are indeed liberated? That is, might it still be accurate to say that gender is a kind of prison in this scenario? Because from my perspective, both genders, the assigned one and the chosen one, are different prisons, though one is more capacious and comfortable than the other. I am uninterested in more roomy, responsive, lusher prisons. Even the trans woman's gender is such that it couldn't not be chosen. That is, the possibility of not being a gender, to be something other than a gender, is always and already foreclosed. And that is the carcerality inherent to gender as such. One cannot become outside of gender. It is coercive and compulsory. This is not to denigrate the chosen prison, as it were. However, I'm still hesitant to clap for the trans woman's liberation if she chooses a differently textured womanhood, which has, as we know, a history of a whole bunch of violence that might be described as imprisoning. It is that gender demands knowledge of us, from us, and about us. There is an invasive needing to know that gender dictates, or one must be a gender, and a proper one. And this becomes requisite knowledge for the very possibility of engaging another. In short, I need to know not simply what your gender is, but that you are gendered, and you cannot interact with me until those grounds are settled. We have all this discourse on policing as deleterious to the well-being of our communities, and as radical abolitionists, we demand the end of policing. If we are to live this assertion, it is crucial to heed an ameliorative and abolitionist politics toward the ways that gender is policed, which is not merely to say the ways certain genders are derogated over others or against others that are permitted sovereign sway, but more the ways gender itself functions as an extension and iteration of policing. Knowing this, we are to, quote, avoid at all costs the danger of helping the existing cops and judges by becoming a snitch, as Alan Badu writes in Can Politics Be Thought? Or when we see illegible genders flourishing or various departures from the gender binary, we are not to snitch on those genders. Indeed, we are to engage the philosophical radicality of gender abolition by lending an ear to the signal rather than rushing to the police station, as Badu concludes. The chance for no cops and no prisons includes the gender police and gendered imprisonment too. And since gender is an imposition, a non-consensual required imposition, we are punished for not receiving on the terms of the imposition, which puts gender in the realm of the transitive verb to gender or gendering, then gender abolition would just as readily urge an anti-gender position as it would urge, like many already do, an anti-racist and anti-capitalist disposition. It is easy enough to see that the binary and perinatal assignations are impositions, non-consensually given identities that work overwhelmingly to the harm of oneself and others, in as much as that violation is the trauma through which one is permitted to exist in the world. So ask me not who I am, what my gender is, and ask me not to verify others. That is the work of the police. And if we are to aspire toward police abolition, toward no new or old jails, it seems to me we are required to take our claims to their end, the abolition of gender. This livable wreckage is where, in a Foucauldian sense, it's not the assertion of identity that's important. It is where, in Dora Silva Santana's sense, we're constituted by a movement of liberation against gendered racialized oppression. It is moving across and along the waters, the imposed limits of gender. There is another way, are other ways, to live in this world that exhausts the arrangements in place. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Marquise. That was super interesting to listen to. So if I could just, ask all the speakers to put your video on, unmute yourselves. We're gonna chat now, because I think there's so much rich material here. I think the sort of main theme that underlies a lot of this conversation is how we deal with these social categorizations, in that they dictate a lot of our lives. They dictate the police state, they dictate political power, they dictate, you know, education and research and higher educational institutions and how they categorize themselves. And everything from what Megan said of like, can we apply, you know, LGBT categories to people a century ago? And how do we sort of like work through that tension? Because I see it coming a lot and a lot of people struggling with it of like, okay, so these are the social categories that we live in now. These are the lines across which we are being oppressed, but we also want to fight against them. Is there a way to be able to occupy both spaces at once? Or do you feel like it absolutely has to take one direction, or short-term versus long-term? How do you work through that tension? Anybody, just go ahead.
Briefly for me, I continually make intellectual and socio-political recourse to the notion, Ruth Wilson Gilmore's, I believe, notion of non-reformist reforms. So this is to say that, yeah, the conditions of prisons are horrendous, and ultimately, if we ascribe to abolitionist sentiments, we want to abolish all prisons. But in the interim, on the way to that, there are ways that we can ameliorate the conditions. We can make the conditions more livable for the people who are there, in a way that is not a kind of expansion or strengthening of these institutions, these systems. So how can we do that? How can we concede that we need to do something to heal and facilitate healing for people now, while we're on the way to something else? How can we do that without capitulating to the purported necessity or naturalness or divinity of these systems? It's a very tricky dance, I think, but that I think is at least in a more abstract way, how I would approach that, non-reformist reforms.
Amazing. Thank you. Andrew or Megan, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I was thinking about, I guess, the first part of your question with regards to, and this probably speaks a lot to Megan's project, that, you know, the terminology and the categories of the LGBTQ plus are very contemporary in many ways. They don't necessarily have geographic or kind of temporal mobility, yet they're still applied and consistently applied in contemporary politics, contemporary discussions. And this is something that I do run into quite a bit with my own research, thinking about sexuality, the politics of sexuality and sexual governance in specifically Southwest Asia and North Africa or the Middle East. And, you know, there's a politic of intimacy that these categories refer to, I think, and you know, that politic of intimacy is, regardless of the category that you're using, it's there, right? Regardless of how people may or may not identify, when you're reading into history, when you're looking at potentially at these archives, Megan, maybe you can talk more about this. There's an element of relationality that speaks to kind of sexual relations that may not be or may not have the language that we have today. And I think that, you know, it's fine to use that language in kind of the contemporary notions to help us engage in research, but you know, there are other ways to also there are kind of ways to use knowledge and discourses and narratives that speak to kind of that speak to these kinds of intimacies that don't necessarily have these kind of contemporary identifiers.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a tricky area, isn't it? And it is something that academics have been debating for decades the problem of the slipperiness of language and the stickiness of language as well. These labels stick, don't they? And that's part of the problem. And you know, when, for example, researching the archives, I try to be very mindful that, you know, of not necessarily imprinting a modern day understanding of sexuality onto someone on the past. But I think what you're saying, and you know, this idea of being sensitive to and kind of reading those stories in a, you know, part of this, and that the whole language thing, obviously there are some contentious debates at the moment, aren't there, for example around the LGBTQ label, and it's also something that we've been discussing in universities around the whole diversity and inclusivity kind of tick box exercise that universities go through, and I think there is some sort of heartfelt intention behind it as well. But one of the things that came through time and time again as we were talking to managers in various schools, for example, was, well, we don't talk about these issues because partly we're frightened of saying the wrong thing. And I think that it's about intent, isn't it? I think one of these things is we have to, in order to talk about something, you've got to choose some words, haven't you? And I think as long as the intent behind those words and it is well-meaning, I think many of us perhaps would forgive somebody for saying something that we might think is offensive or inappropriate if we feel these are people are genuinely trying to address the issue or talk about these, you know, relationships, identities, and so on. But I don't know, I'd be fascinated to know what some of our, you know, some of the viewers think about this issue, because it's not something we're going to answer tonight, I don't think, because it's something we've been talking about for such a long time. But it's fascinating.
Agreed. I wish we could resolve it in this 1 hour chat, but I'll be a bit too ambitious. But a couple of things that came up as well while you were talking, and why I think it's so important to like tie in, for example, you know, LGBT archives in universities to like the politicization of queerness, to the abolition movement, and that sort of idea that we're trying to capture hidden lives, but you're also not wanting to be visible to powers that want to harm you, which is another slippery slope. And this is especially true of, you know, racialized queer people, and where, you know, safety issues take on whole other dimensions. How do you feel about navigating that tension between the visibility and capturing hidden lives and really celebrating that, but also ensuring safety and invisibility from the powers that be, that the ones we're trying to fight?
But again, this it's another debate that has been going on for a long time, isn't it, within the LGBTQ community? For instance, in those of you old enough to remember the 80s and 90s, there was a trend for outing celebrities, for example, who very often people in the public figure, for example, politicians who might vote against progressive, if we want to use that word, legislation around sexualities, but they themselves were in the closet. But sometimes beyond that, and I think that touches on this issue, doesn't it? That certainly in my research, I've got to be very careful. How do I use this material for people who historically, for a whole range of reasons, and it might not just have been fear of discrimination or fear of legal recourse, wanted to keep their, I hate to use the word private lives, because of course sexuality isn't private, is it? It's not a private issue. It's not an individual issue. It's something that's forged in all sorts of ways in the public sphere. So, you know, that's not necessarily a useful binary, but it's a very, very difficult line to tread, which isn't answering your question at all. It's basically agreeing with you.
I'm sorry, I keep doing these questions of like, here are the two impossible situations. How do we deal with them at the same time? That's, yeah.
I can say something.
Please.
I'm hesitating a little bit only because I'm brutally aware oftentimes as someone who's quite introverted and a bit socially anxious, the way that I might impact the tone of a space. And I want to be mindful of that. But with that, I don't know. I'm not 100% sure, or even like 47% sure about the utility of visibility. I get deeply, deeply, viscerally so, the ways that having representation or being legible to certain kinds of juridical kinds of or legalistic or policy kinds of things. I get the ways that it's important and even healing, safe to be visible to those kinds of powers that be. But I think I want to ask or interrogate in a different way, because I'm curious as to why it's assumed many times, not all the time, but many times, that visibility is necessary for that safety. It seems to me that there might in fact be more, in some ways, utility, more kind of coalitional heft, more something that might be permitted in not being so visible. Because to me, it also seems that visibility presumes a kind of what Fred Moten theorizes through individuation, this assumption that I am and need to be this individual, this discrete thing with an identity that's cordoned off from all these other things. Like I'm not so interested in that. And it seems to me that visibility has that a little bit embedded in it, or rather that has a little bit of visibility embedded in it. So I'm wondering about the generative possibilities of maybe not even invisibility, but a kind of assemblage, a kind of swarm, or a kind of collection, coalition, something that might generate the very thing that we're looking toward, which is to say kind of radical justice. But that does not have to concede to this notion that I am this thing and you are this thing and we are discrete entities that then come together. What might be possible in thinking about the collective or the coalition that is not predicated on the individual, which itself I think is predicated on the visible or the visibilizing. There seems to me to be something possible, something else possible in that. I don't know exactly what, I really don't. But I think part of that is what's enticing about it that I don't know, that we don't know. Because it exceeds the grammars of legibility that we have currently, grammars that are infused with various kinds of, to me, it seems white supremacist and capitalist assumptions of individuality and agency and autonomy, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just my 12 cents on that. But I am deeply always open to, I might be wrong on this. In some ways, I hope that I'm wrong on this because there's a comfort in appealing to visibility. So yeah, I'll end there. I'll just end the rambling there.
Andrew, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think, Marquise and Megan did such a good job kind of outlining positions that really kind of speak to each other. I don't know what else I can add on the spot.
Fair enough. And I don't know why I thought an hour was going to be enough for this discussion. And I feel really bad because there's so many great questions coming through in the Q&A. But if you all have like an extra 5 minutes, I just wanted to put one final sort of question out there that hopefully isn't as impossible. And that sort of picks up on some of what's been coming through in the Q&A. And so what do you envision as a good way to go forward, especially within the academy? And you can answer either from an institutional perspective, an epistemological perspective, whatever you prefer. But how should we be talking about this, researching this, presenting this? I mean, yeah, just another tiny little question.
I mean, I think if I can jump in here, I think the university itself, right, and kind of higher education does so much disciplining to us as scholars that when people who are interested in issues of queer kind of queer epistemologies or issues of queer politics come in, even kind of race politics or kind of from racialized epistemologies, they kind of just disrupt things in a lot of ways. And I think, it's important that as scholars in institutions, we recognize the students that are coming up through the system that have that kind of positionality, and that we are able to help them along where they will see barriers and where they will see gatekeeping. And I think, it's our responsibility also to change kind of the disciplining structures of the institution, of academia, to make it so that not just that we're more capable of doing the things that we want to do, that we're comfortable doing as individuals, but also that can provoke further change and further transformation in how we think about and engage with the world.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really add to that. It's keep talking about it, keep challenging, keep troubling. And also for universities, I think there's a real worry at the moment, certainly in the UK, at times of ongoing austerity, the impact of Brexit and the way that's given voice to all sorts of unpleasant voices, in a way, is for universities to recognise the value in investing in this kind of research, in courses and curriculums that reflect these kind of discussions, because I think there's a real danger that we're in a moment where we might lose that. Lots of, and these kind of issues go across disciplines, and I think that's partly what Andrew's referring to there, to recognise that all sorts of valuable ways in which this encourages cross-disciplinary research, that can prompt social change, cultural change, social change, and attitudes in a way that's for the better for everybody, not just for those in marginalised communities. It's only to the good.
Yeah, that was lovely.
Amazing. Any other final thoughts, Marquise? Do you want to add to that, or?
I think I'm good. Those are both wonderful.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time and your effort and your thoughts today. This has even been more wonderful than I thought. Thank you so much to everyone that wrote stuff out in the Q&A box. I can see them, all the panelists can see them. I think I'm going to go off and think about some of the stuff in there and try to, I don't know, put it somewhere. There's a lot of great comments coming through. For anyone who didn't catch all of it, we'll be uploading a recording of this event on Sage Publishing's YouTube channel. You can find notifications of any upcoming events on our Twitter channel, also Sage Publishing. And yeah, just wanted to say thank you again. This has been really insightful and, I don't know, healing. I can't find the right word, but it's making me warm and fuzzy inside. So I appreciate you all very much.
Thank you. I'll see you all later.
Thank you.
Bye.